Okay, why?
Roar! Roar! No, I have a picture. I thought it'd be a fun way to start things. I have issues. It's my class. I can do what I want. Pew pew. Hey. So we're looking at Wednesday, September 27th. Advanced class. We're going to find out more about this landlady and why she's so perfectly normal. Same thing with that other boy. Book report is due in 7 days. We'll go to the library tomorrow. Make sure you bring your iPad. You're going to need it while we're there. We have our homework, which has downloading of short story homework number 3, and Charles and our nonfiction cheerleaders, because all that's going to be on the quiz coming up, not due until next week. You have 4 options to do for the homework: answering the questions, or the alphabet phrase, taping in your quiz if you do well enough, or the 7 elements, which we're trying to make a bit more detailed so that my lazy kids can't just be all lazy ee. Then we get into our story of the landlady. So far in our story, The Landlady, we have a main character. Who's our main character?
Billy.
Billy Weaver. Nice one. We have Billy Weaver, who is our main character. How old is Billy?
17.
Nice done. He is 17.
He's alive?
What country? Yes, Billy Weaver's alive. He's not dead.
England.
Taking place in England. There. We have, and he gets off the train. What is he looking for when he gets off the train?
Hotel.
A cheap hotel named the Bell and the Dragon. On his way to the cheap hotel, what does he find?
Bed and breakfast.
Bed and breakfast. That's when he finds that one. And he gets off. Which one does he end up? Alex, what are you doing? Sitting just for kids to do homework. Yeah, you stand the whole class period.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, there you go. Okay. And then which one does he end up choosing?
The bed and
Bed and breakfast. Why does he choose the bed and breakfast?
It's cheap.
She doesn't know.
It just affords.
Nice done. He's not really sure why he chooses it. It's just he feels compelled to do it, and he goes up to it, and he goes. And who is it that runs the bed and breakfast?
Weird old lady. Weird not old.
Thank you for saying she's not old. Some older lady who is older than you, but still incredibly young and spry. And so she is the one that is running the place. And then we start getting our little suspicions when she pops out right away, but for the most part, that one's a fairly normal one because he was creepily standing right outside her place for minutes on end. And then, let's see, when he looked in the window of the place, what did he see inside there?
Animals.
Specifically, what kind of animals?
Dog and a bird.
Oh yeah.
A parrot.
Foreshadowing, because we'll get to the end of the story today. What does the foreshadowing mean?
Oh, I know.
Roughly.
It's like stuffing at one point and like I don't know.
Ayana.
Foreshadowing is hints in the story leading up to what might happen.
Nice done.
How dare you?
And so those are the ones we're going to use in our story today. Some of you are already thinking you're picking up on some of the clues. You may be completely wrong. You may be correct. We're going to find out as we get closer to it. We have him wearing his brown trilby hat. And then we had the little dachshund, and then we had a little adorable parrot, and then we found between the hotel, and the bed and breakfast, which was he expecting to be cheaper?
Bell and breakfast. Bell and dragon.
The Bell and Dragon hotel, which ends up being cheaper?
Bed and
Bed and breakfast, which he gets all excited about. Let's see, and then is there anyone else staying at the place?
Yeah.
No, because that's when he walks in, and there's no other hats or coats or anything like that. He does describe her as being slightly dotty. And what does slightly dotty mean? Terhune.
Kind of like too involved and kind of creepy.
No. That just might be where you're going with it. Hobby?
Like grandparent-like, kind of.
Works for me. Whereas the whole, not all there, but just the whole kind of spacey. Dotty usually means kind of spacey. And we have kids who can be sort of dotty, because I have kids who are spacey and remember to bring stuff and have no idea what's going on and stuff like that. And it's usually more applied to girls than boys, where it means like dissy. Matthew?
I was downloading the Landlady part 1, and I started to download the lady part 2.
Yes, why it's not on there.
Yeah, why is it
It's
just...
just
Why
a
would you
picture
try
of
to read
eating
ahead?
pizza.
You're a little child. Problem solved.
It's a picture
Why
of
is
eating
it just a because you
I already answered that. Why would you try to read ahead? It solves the problem right there.
Because I want to.
Silly. You didn't give enough. That, don't you try and be a good kid. There's no place in the school. Dottie. Oh, and when it talks about she was waiting for a young gentleman, once again, not creepy there. It's because girls are allowed to travel because the whole, it's improper. It would only be improper. First floor, landing, we talked about. Oh, we got to the hot water bottle. That's where we stopped. Where she was talking about there was a hot water bottle between the sheets. And this is what they used to use before we had electric blankets. You'd have the hot water bottle. You would slide between the blankets, and that's what you would use. All right. Yeah, it's a picture of a person eating pizza. It's awesome. You guys are so special. So now, picking up from there. Let's see, it's there. Thank you. You guys have your suspicions on what you think our foreshadowing clues are. Hold on to them. When we get to the end, we're going to see how accurate your clues might be. Now, I'll back up a little bit. Mr. Weaver, how no? Oh yeah, she did keep forgetting his name because older people seem to have issues with names and stuff like that. Mr. Weaver, how nice! Well, I put a hot water bottle between the sheets to air them out, Mr. Weaver. It's such a comfort to have a heated bottle in a strange bed with clean sheets. Don't you agree? And you may light the gas fire at any time if you feel chilly. Thank you, Billy said. Thank you ever so much. He noticed that the bedspread had been taken off the bed and that the sheets had been neatly turned back to one side, all ready for someone to get in. I'm so glad you appeared, she said, looking earnestly into his face. I was beginning to get worried. That's all right, Billy answered brightly. You mustn't worry about me. He put his suitcase on the chair and started to open it. And what about supper, my dear? Did you manage to get anything to eat before you came here? Oh, I'm not a bit hungry. Thank you, he said. Hang on a moment. I think I'll just go to bed as soon as possible because tomorrow I've got to get up rather early and report to the office. Oh, well, very well then. Well, I'll leave you now so that you can unpack. But before you go to bed, would you be kind enough to pop into the sitting room on the ground floor and sign the book? Everyone has to do that because it's the law of the land. And we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage of the proceedings, do we? She gave him a little wave of the hand and went quickly out of the room and closed the door. When she's asking him to sign the book, what is the book? Somebody.
Who came in and who...
Yeah, for tax purposes, you just have to keep track of it. So you just sign who you are and where you came from, and that way she pays taxes. Because if you don't do it, then it's considered illegal and you're not keeping track of it. She's like, we don't want to break the law right now. Swanson?
Just a quick question about the story. Is this foreshadowing something?
That's a very vague question.
I know, she steals like the book. Like the book isn't actually like meant for that. Like it's some, like you know those books.
So in other words, you have no idea until we get done what we've been talking about.
No, I'm talking about like those like deep, like you know those books that you write down.
Wait, hang on, hold that thought. Turkey.
So when it says, because it's the law of the land and we don't want to go breaking any laws at this stage in the proceedings.
Yes. Because she's
I
very
think-
law-abiding.
Yeah, I think that's irony because no, wait. Because when we talk about because before we start reading the story, you like kind of implied that something bad was gonna happen and like there's gonna be a whole plot twist and stuff. So I think she's gonna end up doing something bad and therefore breaking the law, therefore contradicting herself.
I do mean to apologize. I didn't mean something bad. I meant memorable. There's definitely something memorable that happens in the story. I didn't mean, I guess just my personality, you guys just assume bad. Which, that's just weird. It feels like you're judging me. But it was definitely a memorable story. Hopefully, my second period did their homework, by the way. We'll find out here in a little bit. Last one, Ray Ray, and I'm moving on.
Okay, so important question. All I need to know is, do the animals get hurt?
Yes.
What kind of question was
We will
that?
find out at the end.
Question. An actual question though.
That's good. Hold on to it. Room, close it. Now, the fact that his landlady appeared to be, pause real quick, appeared to be slightly off her rocker. That's an idiom. What does it mean if you're slightly off your rocker?
Crazy.
Once again, not crazy, but just like grandparenty crazy. Same thing as being slightly dotty. Appeared to be slightly off her rocker, didn't worry Billy in the least. See, he's not worried. After all, she was not only harmless, there is no question about that, but she was also quite obviously a kind and generous soul. He guessed that she had probably lost a son in the war, or something like that, and had just never gotten over it. So a few minutes later, after unpacking his suitcase and washing his hands, he trotted downstairs to the ground floor and entered the living room. His landlady wasn't there, but the fire was glowing in the hearth, and the little dachshund was still sleeping in front of it. The room was wonderfully warm and cozy. I'm a lucky fellow, he thought, rubbing his hands. This is a bit of all right. He found the guest book lying open on the piano, so he took out his pen and wrote down his name and address. There were only 2 other entries above his on the page, and, as one always does with guest books, he started to read them. One was a Christopher Mulholland from Cardiff. The other was Gregory W. Temple from Bristol. Huh, that's funny, he thought suddenly. Christopher Mulholland? The name rings a bell. Now, where on earth had he heard that rather unusual name before? Was he a boy at school? No. Was he one of his sister's numerous young men, perhaps, or a friend of his father's? No, it wasn't one of those. He glanced down again at the book. Christopher Mulholland, 231 Cathedral Road, Cardiff. Gregory W. Temple, 27 Sycamore Drive, Bristol. As a matter of fact, now that he came to think of it, he wasn't at all sure that the second name didn't have almost as much of a familiar ring about it as the first. Gregory Temple, he said aloud, searching his memory. Christopher Mulholland? Such charming boys! A voice behind him answered. And he turned, to pause real quick, just make sure we're on top of things. So he goes down, signs the book. What's wrong with the book?
Two people
He sees 2 names, and what about the names?
They sound familiar.
Sound familiar to him, so maybe people that he knows somewhere from. Such charming boys! A voice behind him answered. And he turned and saw his landlady sailing into the room with a large silver tea tray in her hands. She was holding it well out in front of her and rather high up, as though the tray were a pair of reins on a frisky horse. They sound somehow familiar, he said. They do? How interesting. I'm almost positive I've heard those names before somewhere. Isn't that queer? Like, maybe it's in the newspapers? They weren't famous in any way, were they? I mean, famous cricketers or footballers or something like that? To pause, for those of you who are all American-y, if you don't know what cricket is or what being a cricketer is, what's cricket? It's like baseball, but slower and played over 3 days. And so, seeing like a famous sports star or a football player, their version of soccer. And then it also mentions, so he's trying to figure out, he knows their names from somewhere that he thinks they're famous. And then she brings in a tea tray. And how does she bring in the tea tray?
Very high up.
I brought in
Whoa.
my example one, so we can sort of see how it comes in. So I didn't have teacups, so just use your imagination. And so she comes in with her tea tray, and as she walks in, she comes in as this way. And it says on the tea tray. Mr. Brovicast, that's completely normal. I know, that's how we all walk in carrying our drinks, we want to set them down. And so, maybe slightly unusual, but we've pointed out, she's a little older, and apparently older people have issues. Famous, she said, setting the tea tray down on the low table in front of the sofa. Oh no, I don't think they were famous, but they were extraordinarily handsome. Both of them, I can promise you that. They were tall and young and handsome, my dear. Just exactly like you. Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. No, look here, he said, noticing the dates. Apparently, I see you guys getting all weird and giggly. She's paying a person a compliment. It's called being nice. It's just like when you guys come in, I'm like, hey, you look nice today. You guys don't get all weird and giggly and creepy like that. You're cute. You look very nice today. See?
Thank you.
That's what makes someone a compliment. Not weird at all. Once more, Billy glanced down at the book. Look here, he said, noticing the dates. This last entry is over 2 years old. It is? Yeah, indeed. And Christopher Mulholland's. That's nearly a year before that. That's more than 3 years ago. Oh, dear me, she said, shaking her head and heaving a dainty little sigh. I would never have thought it. How time does fly away from us, doesn't it, Mr. Wilkins? It's Weaver. Weaver. Oh, of course it is, she cried, sitting down on the sofa. How silly of me. I do apologize. In one ear and out the other. That's me, Mr. Weaver. You know something, Billy said. Something that's really quite extraordinary about all this. No, dear, I don't. Well, you see, okay, both of these names, Mulholland and Temple, I not only seem to remember each of them separately, so to speak, but somehow or other, in some peculiar way, they both appear to be sort of connected together as well, as though they were both famous for the same sort of thing. If you see what I mean, like Dempsey and Tunney, for example, or Churchill and Roosevelt. I'm hoping you know who Churchill and Roosevelt are.
Yeah, British Prime Minister and President.
There you go. From way back during World War II, Roosevelt, President of America, and then Churchill was the leader of England. Dempsey and Tunney were this big boxing fight that they had, so their names were always connected to each other. Dempsey, Tunney, Dempsey, Tunney. And so he's like, I know these two names because they're connected to each other in some way, like these two, or the President and the Prime Minister, that their names went together. So not only does he remember them, but he remembers them as being connected to each other. Now see, how amusing! But come over here now, dear. Sit down beside me on the sofa, and I'll give you a nice cup of tea and a ginger biscuit before you go to bed. Oh, you really shouldn't bother, Billy said. I didn't mean to do anything like that. He stood by the piano, watching her as she fussed about with the cups and saucers. He noticed that she had small, white, quickly moving hands and red fingernails. I'm almost positive it was in the newspapers I saw them. I'll think of it in a second. I'm sure I will. There's nothing more tantalizing than a thing like this, which lingers just outside the borders of one's memory. He hated to give it up. Now, wait a minute. Wait a minute. Mulholland. Christopher Mulholland. Wasn't that the name of that Eton schoolboy who was on a walking tour through the West Country, and then all of a sudden, milk? Sugar? Yes, please. And then all of a sudden, Eton schoolboy? Oh, no, my dear. That can't possibly be right, because my Mr. Mulholland was certainly not an Eton schoolboy when he came to me. He was a Cambridge undergraduate. Come over here now and sit next to me. Warm yourself in front of the lovely fire. Come on. Your tea's all ready for you. She patted an empty place beside her on the sofa, and she sat there smiling at Billy and waiting for him to come over. And that's where your part ends, and then I have part 2, which I've not uploaded yet, and so I'm going to read that, so we'll get a chance to finish out from there.
Okay.
So it keeps going. He crossed the room slowly, sat down on the edge of the sofa. She placed his teacup on the table in front of him. There we are. How nice and cozy this is, isn't it? Billy started sipping his tea. She did the same. For half a minute or so, neither of them spoke. But Billy knew that she was looking at him. Her body was half turned towards him. He could feel her eyes resting on his face, watching him over the rim of her teacup. So, once again, she's just drinking her tea. And just sort of watching him as he drinks, as you do when you have company over and you're interested in seeing how they're doing. Now and again, he caught a whiff of a peculiar smell that seemed to emanate directly from her person. It was not in the least unpleasant, and it reminded him, well, he wasn't quite sure what it reminded him of. Pickled walnuts, new leather, or was it the corridors of a hospital? At length, she said, Mr. Mulholland was a great one for his tea. Never in my life have I seen anyone drink as much tea as dear, sweet Mr. Mulholland. Oh, I suppose he left fairly recently, Billy said. He was still puzzling his head about the two names. He was positive now that he had seen them in the newspapers, in the headlines. Left? She said, arching her brows. My dear boy, he never left. He's still here. Mr. Temple's also here. They're up on the 3rd floor. The both of them are there together. Billy set down his cup slowly on the table and stared at his landlady. She smiled back at him, and then she put out one of her white hands and patted him comfortingly on the knee. How old are you, my dear? 17. 17 is the perfect age. Mr. Mulholland was also 17, but I think he was a trifle shorter than you are. In fact, I'm sure he was. And his teeth weren't quite so white. You have the most beautiful teeth, Mr. Weaver. Did you know that? No, they're not as good as they look, Billy said. They've got simply masses of fillings in them at the back. Mr. Temple, of course, was a little older, she said, completely ignoring his remark. He was actually 28, and yet I never would have guessed it if you hadn't told me. Never in my whole life. There wasn't a blemish on his entire body. What? Billy said. His skin was just like a baby's. There was a pause. Billy picked up his teacup and took another sip of his tea. Then he set it down again, gently in its saucer. He waited for her to say something else, but she seemed to have lapsed into another of her silences. He sat there, staring straight ahead of him into the far corner of the room, biting his lower lip. That parrot, he said at last. You know something? It had me completely fooled when I first saw it through the window from the street. I could have sworn it was alive. Alas, no longer. It's most terribly clever the way it's been done. It doesn't look in the least bit dead. Who did it? I did. Wait, you did it? Of course. Have you met my little Basil as well? She nodded towards the dachshund curled up so comfortably in front of the fire. Billy looked at it. Suddenly, I'm not even done reading yet. And suddenly, he realized that this animal had all the time been just as silent and motionless as the parrot. He put out a hand and touched it gently on the top of its back. The back was hard, cold, and when he pushed the hair to one side of his fingers, he could see the skin underneath, grayish black, dry, perfectly preserved. Good gracious me! How absolutely fascinating! He turned away from the dog and stared with deep admiration at the little woman beside him on the sofa. It must be most awfully difficult to do a thing like that. Oh, not in the least. I stuff all of my little pets myself when they pass away. Will you have another cup of tea? No, thanks, Billy said. The tea tasted faintly of bitter almonds, and he didn't much care for it. You did sign the book, didn't you? Oh, yeah, I did. That's good, because later on, if I happen to forget what you were called, then I can always come down here and look it up. I still do that almost every day with Mr. Mulholland and Mr. Temple. Billy said, Gregory Temple. Excuse my asking, but haven't there been any other guests here except them in the last 2 or 3 years? Holding her teacup high in one hand, inclining her head slightly to the left, she looked up at him, out of the corners of her eyes, and gave him another gentle little smile. No, my dear. Only you. And that's where it stops.
Taxidermists that stuffs human beings.
So now, let's talk about our story. There are foreshadowing clues throughout the story. One of the big ones happens there at the end, and it's fine if you don't pick up on it, because most of you might not. It's the taste of the tea. What does the tea taste like?
Bitter almonds.
Bitter almonds. Bitter almonds is a very specific taste that is only connected to one thing.
Medicine?
Not medicine.
Anesthesia.
What?
A thing called cyanide. Cyanide, the dead giveaway, is a taste of bitter almonds. So, from this, now that we have the bitter almonds, we can start extrapolating backwards throughout the entire story. The dog and parrot are taxidermied, meaning they are stuffed. Who did the taxidermying?
The woman.
The old lady did it herself. And the fact that we find out that she's apparently not good at living things, but she can stuff things very well. So what did we assume happened to him, by the way?
Stuffed.
He died and got stuffed. And so the fact that he is still there and still stuffed, because as she says, I stuff all of my little pets that pass away. Now, when we go back to the very beginning, she's aware of the skin conditions of her guests and talks about the teeth and the fact that there's no blemishes, meaning no scars or marks or pimples. There's only one way she would know if there were blemishes on their body, and that's, of course, because
She stuffs them.
she had seen them during, we'll call it hobby time, as she was going through and doing all that. She smells like a hospital, leather, or pickles. Ayana?
So, I heard that when you're doing taxidermy, that you get a specific smell on you.
It's because of the chemicals that you have to use. The formaldehyde is really hard to get the smell to die away. And so that becomes that formaldehyde smell that is on her. And so apparently that's where this sort of comes from her, because apparently she does this hobby a lot. She keeps wanting Billy to drink his tea. Why would that be foreshadowing, Jake?
She wants to kill him.
And that's why originally she wasn't going to offer him tea, because what did she offer him originally?
Milk.
Before even the biscuits, when he's up in his bedroom.
Supper.
Supper. And she's like, would you like to have supper? And he goes, no, I don't need supper. And she's like, oh, no supper. And that's why when he comes downstairs, she brings in the tea. He's like, I didn't even want tea. She's like, oh, have some tea. I insist. And so she ends up giving him some tea.
I insist.
And we find out that Mr. Mulholland loved his tea.
Oh.
And now we find out why that's so. Why is it important that Mr. Mulholland loved his tea?
Cyanide.
Because apparently the dude chugged it down. He recognizes the names of the past residents. Where does he know them from? The missing people in the newspapers. And so he does recognize them being together because they both went missing as they went around and all that. She wants to make sure he has signed the book
She doesn't forget the name.
because eventually she can't ask him for his name. And so she has to be able to find ways to be able to remember who he is. But that's not it. There's more throughout the entire story.
Wait, there's more.
When he arrives, there are no other hats or coats. Why is that going to be a sign of foreshadowing?
They're all dead.
Swanson?
Because they're already on the stuffed people.
And what did we, because when there's no hats or coats, what do we assume about the place?
No
It's
one's
empty.
there.
It's empty, no one's there. What do we find out later?
They're two people.
And she says, oh no, they haven't left. They're upstairs. Like, well, Mr. Brovicast, but none of their stuff is downstairs. Yup. So we find out that's one of our clues. She explains that they are all alone, and later on the others have never left. It's that same thing, the fact that the others haven't left, and the fact that the third floor is where they are staying. The price of the room being cheap was also foreshadowing. Why would that be foreshadowing in the story? Yeah.
Because she wants to persuade him to stay.
Does it matter what price she charges?
No.
Because she gets to keep all his money no matter what. She can make it as cheap as she wants. Because all she wants to do is make sure he stays there. So that's why she gets to make it really, really cheap on him. Seeing the dog and parrot. Ooh, when he first saw the dog and the parrot, what does he say when he sees them in the window?
It's a good sign.
It's a good sign. Why is it a good sign?
Because
He
they're
thought they were
healthy.
alive.
Because he thought they were alive, and that means, as you guys explained yesterday, because if you can keep animals alive, that means you can keep humans alive. And exactly. And apparently she can't keep animals alive. She opens the door as soon as he rings the bell.
She's awaiting her new puppet.
She's been awaiting her new pet. So apparently she was staring out the window. And that the room is all ready for him.
Can't wait.
She's adding him to her collection. Ooh, with the drink. How does she bring the drinks in?
She doesn't spell it.
Nicely done. Because if you have the cyanide in there, and you have steam coming up from your tea, the last thing you want to do is be walking in normally, because as you walk in normally, the steam kind of comes up and rises. Like, hey, how are you? There you go. So we're not so. That is your story. Hey, kids getting up to see if I'm going to yell at them because I wasn't quite done talking. I'm hoping my second period did their homework, which was they were not allowed to say a word to you about this one. They were not happy.
Told me, but I didn't hear what
But yay. All right.